Sure, you got to start your starts. But don't you wish you streamed Baker Mayfield, Kobe Fairbairn, the Vikings DST last week? If you watched last week's episode, you did, and you had three top three options. Today, we'll go through the best streamers and stashes for week 2 of the fantasy season on the Fantasy First Down. So waivers are in for week 2, and now it's time to sort out who we're going to start. Today, we're talking about the best streamers and stashes for week 2 of the fantasy season. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube so you can check out all of our content right when it comes out. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, where I release all my rankings first. On Twitter, we are at Fantasy First Down with no O. And our website, where you can find our rankings as well, is ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can also check out my Streamers and Stashes article, where I go into a little bit of different detail at football.rasball.com. Plus, I'll have my slot versus wide receiver analysis out in the next couple of days as well. But today, we're talking about who you should be starting that you wouldn't usually be starting each week. We're talking about streamers and stashes. And my QB streamers, amazingly, are exactly the same two guys in exactly the same order. Last week, I talked about Baker Mayfield being an excellent streamer against the Commanders. He finishes the QB2, and this time he takes on Detroit, who, as we know, is very susceptible through the air. We saw them have a nice little battle last week, and I expect that once again, this is going to be a game where there's a lot of passing, and it's also, according to the Vegas lines, expected to be the highest scoring game. So you'd have to feel like Mayfield is going to be heavily involved. Meanwhile, Jared Goff was also a top 12 quarterback last week, and this week he even gets an even better matchup against Tampa Bay, who you realistically can't run the ball on. So they're going to have to pass, and they're going to do it regularly. So I expect both of these guys to have a big game in what could be a little bit of a shootout. Meanwhile, if you're not worried about this week and you're thinking about stashes, well, I don't love stashing quarterbacks on my bench. But if you're going to stash somebody, for me, it's Jordan Love. We know he's out 3 to 4 games, but if you're struggling at quarterback, he is a guy who's going to be solid when he gets back. He should be a top 10 option most weeks. If you have an IR slot in particular, this is a guy that you need to be picking up because people will do dumb stuff and drop players like Jordan Love. I've seen far better players than this dropped with minor injuries. I saw someone drop Puka Nacua in a random league as well. Like, this sort of weird stuff happens. So make sure you're checking out all the transactions that are happening in your league because you're going to see players like this become available. Running back wise, and I mean, everyone knows that Jordan Mason's going to be a good option. Realistically, hopefully you picked him up off waivers if you needed a running back. And if you did, and if you've got him on your bench, and a lot of people do, I'd be starting him this week. I think this is a solid matchup. I feel like he's going to be a top 15 running back in most leagues. He should be someone that you're starting. I'm not saying you can pick him up off waivers and put him in, but I'm saying he's someone that you should be using this week. Likewise, J.K. Dobbins is someone that would have been pretty expensive on waivers if he was available. And likewise, if you've got him on your bench, this is a good week to be starting him. If you're not starting him this week, you're probably not starting him until it's bye weeks at least. And even then, most of the time he's going to struggle relative to how he's going to go this week. He's taking on the Panthers. The Panthers have a pretty good pass defense, although they really struggled all around against the Saints, meaning the Saints could do whatever they wanted. But it's in the run game that they really struggle, especially with Derek Brown being out for the season. So I do expect that J.K. Dobbins is going to get a lot of touches. And realistically, if you've still got Gus Edwards, and he might even be available because, again, people do dumb things. Even if you've got Gus Edwards, he's someone you can start. I expect both of these guys to get at least 15 touches to be very efficient. I wouldn't be surprised if they both score touchdowns. These are both guys that you can definitely start, especially in non-PPR and half PPR leagues. But especially in PPR, J.K. Dobbins becomes a really solid option. I expect he has another good game. Alexander Mattison was an interesting one last week. We did know coming into the season, I did talk about this in the preseason, that Mattison was likely to be the receiving back. We thought it was going to be Dylan Lowry at first, but it became very clear from the preseason usage that Mattison was going to be the receiving back. What we didn't expect is he was going to get nearly half of the early down touches. That's pretty wild. And hence he becomes the more valuable of the two running backs compared to Zamir White. Now, that's only going to be in the case of games they're losing. but they're taking on the Ravens this week. And realistically, they're going to be losing most weeks. But in particular, this week against the Ravens, I expect them to lose by over a score. I expect we're going to see a whole lot of Madison. I expect he's going to get a solid amount of usage in PPR leagues. If you're desperate at running back, because there are some injuries around, he is someone that you can certainly start. Meanwhile, running back stashes are extremely important in fantasy football. And one guy that I'd be picking up and potentially even using if you need to, depending on what happens, is Jeff Wilson. Now, Jalen Wright's also in there as well, and he's someone that you should be picking up too, especially long-term. I think long-term of the two Miami backs, Jalen Wright's going to be the better option. But I expect probably for the next couple of weeks at least, Wilson's ahead of Wright. We saw that same thing happen with Devon Achane last season, where he started out as being the running back 4 and slowly made his way up the depth chart. I expect the same thing happens with Wright, and that means that this is your window to strike with Jeff Wilson. So feel free to pick him up. He's going to be free in most leagues. He's not even being taken in most leagues. And if we see Raheem Mostert and or Devon Achane being out, all of a sudden Jeff Wilson becomes the guy. Now, if both are out, Wilson is a guy that you absolutely should be starting, and Jalen Wright becomes an interesting option. But I think that Wilson's probably going to be the main guy in Miami in that case, and that's going to make him really interesting for fantasy. So he's a guy that you can probably start in a game that they're actually expected to win against Buffalo, according to the Vegas line. Now, we saw that Tank Bigsby got the same amount of carries as Travis Etienne. Now, I don't think he's going to take over that role, but I think it's at least interesting to see that he's not only the clear backup, he's also getting weekly usage. That means he's someone you can stick on your bench. If you're desperate, you can use him. And if Travis Etienne gets an injury, all of a sudden he becomes a league winner. So I really like Tank Bigsby. He's someone you've got to pick up. He's probably the most valuable bench stash now, but Blake Corum is clearly not the backup for the Rams. Bucky Irving's in the same situation. Didn't run as much as Rachaad White. We know they give White a lot of touches and he's good out of the backfield. But I do think that Bucky Irving's was very impressive. He had one of the most efficient games we've ever seen from a rookie running back in week 1. I feel like he's going to have an average performance this week against Detroit, but he's someone I want to stick on my bench because if Rachaad White goes down, all of a sudden, again, Bucky Irving becomes a league winner. He's a definite top 24 running back, possibly even higher than that. Let's talk wide receivers. This week, Jameson Williams, obviously, really good chance to repeat. We talked about last week how Detroit did whatever they wanted, and Williams was the main guy that got involved. This week, better matchup against Tampa Bay. He should have another solid week, especially given he's the wide receiver too. And we know that Tampa realistically only has one strong cornerback, so they're going to be on Amon-Ra St. Brown a lot of the time, except when obviously he's traveling to the slot and they don't want to push him to the slot. So Jameson Williams will be the guy getting a lot of targets. I expect he has another solid game. He's someone you can stream this week if you've got him on your bench usually. Wan'Dale Robinson is a guy that's going to be available across most of the league. I had him as a streamer last week and he got 12 targets. That's the second most targets in the league behind only Cooper Kupp, who had like over 20 targets, which is absolutely insane. But yeah, Wan'Dale Robinson, second most targets in the league, tied with, I think, Tyreek Hill and one other person. Absolutely crazy. Now, I didn't do much with them because it was a bad matchup. This week, significantly better matchup against Washington. He traditionally only plays in 11 personnel, but they run quite a lot of 11 personnel. They're likely to be trailing in this game, even though it's against the Commanders. You'd expect them to step up, and the Commanders have one of the weakest secondaries. They also have a rookie in the slot in Mike Samer still, so I do expect that Robinson is going to get a lot of opportunities and, again, a lot of targets, especially in a PPR league. He is a valid starting option this week if you're struggling at the wide receiver position, particularly with injuries. And we saw Puka Nacua out for a month and a bit. That means that Demarcus Robinson, who was the number 3, becomes the number 2, and we saw how valuable that was towards the end of last season and also in this game. A lot of people talking about Tyler Johnson. He'll be the number 3 guy, but Robinson is definitely the guy you want of those two Rams, I guess we could say backups, but Robinson is a starter. Suddenly he goes into that number 2 role, and there's so much value there. So he's someone you could certainly start. The matchup against Arizona is not great, but it's still good enough that if you're struggling at wide receiver, I'd be willing to start him. If not, definitely someone you just stick on your bench. And even Tyler Johnson is a valid pickup. Now, stashes. I couldn't believe when I saw this. Keon Coleman's available in a third of leagues. I don't understand at all. He is the number 1 option in Buffalo. There's so many people going for Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel. Guess what? They're splitting the one role. They're both playing that slot role. It's not even an every down role. Their outside receivers are Keon Coleman and Matt Collins. Now, you don't want Matt Collins. He's going to be involved in the red zone, but realistically, the number 1 is Keon Coleman. Keon Coleman is going to be the guy you want in Miami. We're going to see a lot of touches spread out across this offense, but Coleman has a real opportunity to take over that Stephon Diggs role. With Josh Allen at quarterback, I feel like that's something he needs to do. Last week, they ran the ball a lot. It was a really good running matchup. This week against Miami, I expect they're trailing. They're going to have to pass the ball a whole lot more. I would definitely want Keon Coleman involved. I don't know if I necessarily want to start him. You want to let him develop into that role a little bit. But I think 4 or 5 weeks into the season, all of a sudden, he's an every down wide receiver and could be a top 24 option. Elijah Moore, surprisingly, was playing ahead of Jerry Jeudy, not just in stats, but also in position. We expected Jeudy to be the slot guy, but Elijah Moore played in the slot like 3/4 of the time. And we saw that he had significantly more snaps than Jeudy. Now, we don't know if Judy's going to develop into something and eventually turn into the every down slot guy, or alternatively, at least take over the every down role from Moore. But at the moment, it's Amari Cooper number 1 and Elijah Moore number 2. Now, that's not necessarily going to transition into a lot of fantasy production, but there are going to be weeks where that's going to be really useful. And if it continues this way and Moore does become the number 2 in this offense, all of a sudden he's a guy that you should at least have on your bench as a bye week guy. Josh Reynolds, another solid option. He's the number 2 in Denver. Look, we knew this coming into the season. I had them stashed already in a heap of leagues, but I didn't expect them to pass the ball as much as they did. I think Cortland Sutton had 11 targets. Josh Reynolds had 8 targets, and then Vele had 8 targets as well, which is pretty wild. I do think that Reynolds is going to be heavily involved. Vele is also a valid pickup as well, but I feel like his job is a little bit less secure. I think there is still that reasonable chance that we see Troy Franklin eventually come in, or Marvin Mims eventually come in and take over one of their roles. I guess that's also possible with Josh Reynolds, given he's the veteran. They might just decide, well, look, we're not winning this season. We might as well try the young guys. But I still think I'd pick up Reynolds as a guy who's going to be valid on bye weeks if you're looking for some depth options and you're in that sort of deeper 12-team or 14-team league. Now, tight end has been very interesting this week. Obviously, Isaiah Likely is a guy that most people are going to be starting. I didn't even mention him. I think that's blatantly obvious. Jordan Akins is someone no one's talking about, though. I think David Njoku is going to miss up to a month, and we know that Jake Ferguson's probably going to be out for a while. There is no clear replacement for Jake Ferguson. I think it's going to be a mix of Schoonmaker and maybe Spanford. Maybe they bring someone else in. But Jordan Akins is the clear backup for David Njoku. During the game before Njoku got injured, Njoku played all but 3 snaps. Then Akins came in and played every other snap. There was no other tight end involved. Now, they will get someone off the practice squad, probably Mitchell Patton or someone like that. But I do expect that Jordan Akins is going to be pretty close to an every down tight end in a role that we've seen can be very productive in Cleveland. He's a guy that's an interesting streamer this week against Jacksonville in a game they're expected to possibly trail, and it could be a little bit of a passing game. We know that you can attack Jacksonville through the air, so that's going to be really interesting. Meanwhile, Colby Parkinson, with Puka Nacua out, all of a sudden a whole heap of targets opened up, and we did talk about DeMarcus Robinson and Tyler Johnson being involved, but it's entirely possible that Parkinson's the guy instead. Tyler Higbee's out for most of the season. He's obviously on the pup list. Colby Parkinson's the clear number 1 guy. He played like 80 to 90% of the snaps, and I expect that will continue. Arizona's not the greatest matchup, but he's certainly someone that you can start. I would expect that he's going to be ranked as a top 12 tight end by most people. And for that reason, I would happily have Colby Parkinson in my lineup. Meanwhile, a couple of guys I don't really want in my lineup, but they're at least interesting. Tucker Kraft has taken over from Luke Musgrave. This is wild to me. I like Musgrave so much more of these 2 tight ends, but I'm not the coaching staff in Green Bay. It's not my decision. Ultimately, Kraft played like 50-something of the 60-odd snaps. Musgrave was also out there for about 17, I want to say, snaps. But it is going to be Kraft that's going to be the guy. How many targets he gets, I don't know, because Musgrave seemed to get a surprising amount of targets when he was out there, and Kraft wasn't getting as many targets even though he was on the field for the majority of the time. So I kind of need to see it again. But I do think there is the possibility of talking about the every down tight end in Green Bay. And when you have terrible quarterbacks, they tend to go to the tight ends a lot because they're the safer check down option. So it is possible that we see Malik Willis go to Tucker Kraft a heap. Just see what happens this week, and then he's someone that you might want to stick into your lineups later on. Theo Johnson, meanwhile, is the clear tight end for the Giants. Do you want the Giants tight end? Well, you did when it was Darren Waller, and Theo Johnson's not Darren Waller, but we don't know exactly what this role is going to look like. It does seem to be an every down role, and there's not that many of those in tight ends around the league. So in a deeper league, Theo Johnson becomes a valid guy that you can pick up. I think he's someone could develop into an actual role, there's not that many quality players at the Giants behind Malik Neighbors. So it's Wan'Dale Robinson and Theo Johnson kind of adding in with those guys. And we'll just have to wait and see what that looks like. But I think he could be an interesting pickup. Now, I talked about this in the waiver wire show. Obviously, my kicker streamers, Cameron Dicker, the kicker, against Carolina. We know that this is a solid matchup because they're going to score so many points. I don't think they're going to score as many field goals, so this certainly has a capped ceiling. I certainly am not saying that Dick is likely to be the number one kicker this week. Could happen, but I'm not saying that's really the direction we're going in. I do think, though, that he has a very safe floor. And floor is important for kickers. If you can say, well, they're probably going to score 5 touchdowns, there's 5 points immediately and probably at least 1 field goal. I mean, that gives you that base of 8 points that you absolutely want from your kicker. I think that's a valid option. Meanwhile, Chris Boswell takes on Denver last week. He scored all of their points, all 18 points. He had 6 field goals, same as Jake Moody, but the difference is that he was the only one scoring for them. Now, obviously, that should improve this week against Denver, who we saw you can score on. Seattle did that pretty easily. Pittsburgh aren't as good as Seattle, but I do think possibly that Boswell will have another strong game, especially with Justin Fields expected to be the quarterback again. Finally, DSTs. I mean, I talked about Carolina being terrible. Chargers take them on. They're a must-have DST. They're not going to be available in your league probably anymore, but it's worth having a look if you are not happy with your current DST. The other option is the Colts. I think with Malik Willis there, we don't know what that's going to look like, but it's unlikely to be pretty. And that's all we've got for tonight. That is my streamers and stashes. If you've got any questions, please make sure you hit me up. You can say something in the comments, or you can message me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. My rankings will be out in the next day or two on ffdfantasyfootball.com. And of course, it would be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube and check out my articles over on Razzball. Razzball also has a heap of extra tools you can use, a heap of really good analysis tools. So if you like to do your own analysis instead of looking into what other people are saying, then definitely go over to Razzball. In my rankings, which were, by the way, 6th overall on Fantasy Pros last week, I use all of the Razzball tools to help me out with my rankings. I recommend that you probably should be doing the same if you like to go in that direction. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the coming days when we'll talk about start sits and I'll reveal my rankings and talk about week 2's games. I will see you then.